Hey everyone, welcome to episode 21 of The Followers. This week we are bringing you an episode on fitness testing and some of the different, practices we input ourselves and some ideas around what you may want to be thinking about or what lines you want to be thinking down when planning your upcoming season or restart of your season in some cases if it happens to be. But so we'll jump right into it. Where would we like to start, I suppose?
Suppose we'll start off with when it comes to selecting your tests, a lot of people say oh, I saw Dublin footballers do this test. I will definitely do that with mine. Or I saw Bowden Barrett do the Bronco test on Instagram. I'll definitely do that with my soccer players. So I think before we focus on just tests themselves and how they run up and how you compare them to norms is do an analysis and what's technically called a needs analysis of the sport you're working in or the athlete you're working in or athletes. So say I predominantly work with GAA, normally hurling and some football, and then some individual athletes as well. I know you're both currently with rugby, but often branch out into GAA and other sports as well. So you need to take a look at your sport and what are really, for us from an S&C point of view, the important components of fitness, and then do we need to focus a little bit heavier on some components and even do a few tests of those. So say for GAA, for example, it's an alactic aerobic sport. So it's a lot of sprints, jumps, tackles, high bursts of energy, which are 0 to 10 seconds long, followed by your longer periods in of walk and jog and stuff like that. So the important components of fitness there are aerobic capacity, but also speed, power, and strength for the bursts in between. Now, you will have more so in Gaelic football, some anaerobic or glycolytic components as well, and you can test that, but realistically, it's going to be the more aerobic, anaerobic stuff. When it comes to rugby, then you probably are more on the anaerobic side, or the strength, speed, power will be more important and position dependent. The aerobic stuff will come down a bit. And in soccer, probably that bit more aerobic with speed more of an important component than power and strength to a point. And then as you go down to kind of individual sport athletes, like some athletics, strongman, stuff like that, it'll have more of a focus on what their specific event is. So a jumper, a shot putter, a thrower in general will be more focused on power. Aerobic capacity won't really be as much of an impact there, just to get them through training. A 100-meter runner, obviously speed and power. A 400-meter runner, speed, power, and a glycolytic ability there as well. Then as you go up to an 800-meter runner or longer, aerobic fitness, but you're going to be looking a lot more in detail at your aerobic fitness, like where's their lactate threshold, everything that way. How do they utilize fuel at different intensities, everything. So they're the main things you do to try and set out. Once you've identified the main components of fitness that are important, then you go and select tests based on that, as opposed to some people who will just say, I saw this test, I'm going to use it, and it may not be that particularly relevant for your sport or your athlete. They're kind of my main thoughts, and I'm going starting to select stuff. Anything on that?
No, I just take a look at, obviously just taking in what sport it is you're working with and making sure that you're not just applying some kind of a random, I suppose fitness test number one, but approach or random kind of just, approach to increasing fitness. If it, like say, there's no point in in me say with rugby there, working out a fitness test that's going to help me work on some kind of a fitness plan afterwards that's going to have guys covering 7, 8, 9, 10K or kilometers, because they're never going to cover that kind of range. So I'm like, well, it's fitness for the sport we're playing, and what different types of fitness are being called upon. So yeah, I think that's often something that you might see is overlooked, maybe not necessarily by S&C coaches, but by maybe in sport coaches, maybe like Gaelic coaches, Gaelic football coaches, or rugby coaches, hurling coaches who don't maybe have an S&C background or any kind of training in that line, and it can just be a case of, well, we need to get fitter, so let's run, and there's no there's no goal behind it, and like the fitness test could, if I think back to some of the random fitness tests I've had to be a part of in my Gaelic football playing, like just running laps. Just it's like, all right, lads, we're going to run 4 laps and see how we get on. In what way does that transfer into how we're going to improve our fitness training? For the sport we're playing. So yeah, that it's just kind of thinking about what your, what sport is, what your output is, what type of fitness you actually need to be working on.
I think on that we also need to have a think as well of just why actually are we conducting these tests? What are the main reasons? And sometimes as S&C coaches, you can say like, well, it's to show that I did make him a bit fitter or a bit faster or a bit stronger, so that when I hand in my bill after a couple of months, I can show like, look, it did work. I wasn't just filling time here.
You get paid.
Well, but also there is the whole point behind it. Like, you are trying to show the players they're getting fitter too, and to show them that these are the specific areas of fitness we want you to improve at. And then why you're selecting specific tests for a sport, an athlete, whatever like that. It's worth highlighting that to management and players as you go along, without like giving them a 40-minute lecture on it or anything like that, but drip feeding that little bit of information so that everyone involved can see the relevance and the importance of what you're doing and why you're doing it. So there's greater buy-in in terms of the application of the test, the application of the training program around it, and also a bit of understanding as why aren't we spending 10 minutes here kicking the ball over the bar instead of doing this fitness test? So when they understand the importance of it, they realize, oh yeah, that's fair enough here in this 10-minute block once every 6 weeks. Like,
yeah, it'll highlight even for doing kind of individual work, I suppose, with players. The way I like to look at it is, if you remember to when you're playing FIFA, if you click onto a player, it'll show like a little graph. And the idea is you want, so some players will have huge attacking and no defense. You want to try and get, if you put the S&C, so if you put speed, power, strength, fitness as kind of those corner points, you want to make the most well-rounded athlete possible, obviously without having any influence on their actual talent or playing ability. So if they have a fitness score that's off the charts, but maybe their strength is really low, then okay, well, there's no real need for him to be doing these crazy fitness sessions when he could be working on his strength, could be working on his speed. So just having these measures for every element, even if he could be the fittest person in your team, so you're like, right, well, if he cuts a couple of seconds off his Bronco, it's not really going to make the world of difference, but it'll show him how, out of balance is the wrong word, but like, out of balance, because I can't think of a better word, his overall athletic profile is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And like, we have to bear in mind too that different athletes will have to rely on different components of fitness. Like, say for rugby, Conor Murray, I assume anyway, will have much higher aerobic fitness than Tadhg Furlong, and Tadhg Furlong will have much higher strength and power than Conor Murray because it's position specific. And then even if you dig deeper into two athletes who play in the same position, one may rely an awful lot more on their game sense or their natural ability to read the game, whereas another may rely an awful lot more on their aerobic fitness. You're not just going to focus on that, but you will have an understanding yourself as to why one may be above that of another.
You'll also have stats then on position specific stuff. So if you do a test, obviously someone can say, oh, well, obviously the fullback's going to be quicker than me, I'm a prop. Whereas you who have data and you're like, okay, well, you're also 10 seconds slower than our average prop as well. So you do have work to do. It's easier to get it across to the player when you can bring it down to their level or to their specific position.
Yeah, those norms are so important. You'll find, like, depending on your sport and depending on your test you do, and that is a big influence, I find anyway, in choosing tests, that if I have norms both on other sports I can compare to elite level performers, but also the same players or similar teams in similar level of playing, if I have norms based on that over the past few seasons that I can compare to, it does give you an idea of specific areas you need to improve on, and they're a huge help. Just one point I want to make on sorry, Damien, on choosing tests that you see other teams or coaches using. It can be helpful in that if you're new to rugby and you're like, okay, I need to do this needs analysis, I need to do all this thinking about what specific tests to do. But if I see New Zealand and England and Ireland and the local semi-professional rugby club doing the same test, there is probably a fair chance that it's worth you doing with your rugby team as well. So maybe like just make sure it's obviously age appropriate. Don't do like a really hard Bronco with the under 8s. That's fairly irrelevant. But if it's around the same age profile and, you know, they might not be the same in terms of experience, you can rely on the expertise of other coaches to be like, yeah, fair enough. I'll let them make that decision for me. I'll just find out a bit of info around norms, understand they're not to the same level, but they are targets we can have far off in the distance. Sorry, Damien, go on.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I was just going to mention that on that there that when it comes to fitness, and this is more focused on rugby, say with your pack players, where you might come across coaches saying that they don't need to be fit, they need to be powerful. And you're like, well, that's great if they're only going to say have one scrum in the game, but if they what if we have 10, like are they going to be as effective as they go through the games, and trying to explain that, making sure that that the understanding of why certain players, especially in a sport like rugby where you do have very different positional demands, that it isn't about just getting fit for the sake of being fit or to be able to run, that often is so that you can repeat those power outputs as efficiently and as effectively as you can at the beginning of a game. So that's the only other thing. Now, obviously with your Gaelic sports and soccer, your field sports like that, it's a little bit different because there's a lot of, pretty much all the positions are similar in nature, but just for something like rugby where each position is very specific, that's something that's a conversation I found to be a great one for just explaining things from the other side.
Yeah, I think it's overlooked in rugby that you can have, like if someone's gassed at half time or after just 50 minutes, in maybe soccer or Gaelic, you'd kind of overlook and you're like, right, well, they're just not fit enough. Whereas in rugby, you're like, okay, well, if we can get a serious 50 minutes out of him, we can just bring on the next player, and because they have that luxury, and it's an actual like strategy in rugby. So it's maintained they don't have to have the biggest fitness levels, but we have to just get them to that base where they can give us enough at their top ability that we can then bring in someone else to finish off the game.
Yeah, it's a good point in that, like, it's ultimately your aerobic fitness that's going to decide how long it takes to recover between those high intensity efforts. And that's why over the past few years, having like spent a bit of time in GA, really improving power and strength has gone up so much in GA in the past 15 years. But I think in the last 5, particularly driven by Dublin and Tyrone to an extent as well, and Jim McGuinness, who was at Donegal, the aerobic fitness has really gone up as well, as coaches have learned the kind of importance of long-term programming, and that you can develop them both together slowly and over time, but also that while you may be really strong and powerful in one lift and one jump, that to repeat that over time, you need the underlying aerobic fitness there to support that. Also for the likes of rugby athletes, for general health, just carrying around that much weight, you're going to need a decent aerobic fitness just to be healthy yourself. And like if it's the likes of a shot put or whatever, you don't need to be aerobically fit to throw 6 shots at a competition, but to do your training with any level of efficiency at all, you need to be fit just to get through those trainings, so that you're not waiting around 5 minutes between every throw or every lift, because you just don't have that kind of time to put into it all. When it comes to select and test, then there's a few things I would always find important. Now, Shane's point there of your stats or your norms of stuff you can compare to, I think that's really helpful. Not to always be constrained by those and always stick to those just so you have norms, or always try and achieve those. Because again, if it's an average, if I have my head in the oven and my feet in the freezer, my body is normal temperature. So like you can't always be constrained by those, but they do give you kind of ranges to aim for. Other things that are important then is how valid is it, how reliable is it, and how practical is it? That if you're picking an aerobic test, how certain are you that it's testing the type of aerobic fitness that you need for your players? I remember when we were doing the Masters, they showed us, and it was very much a health focused test, the Chester step test, where to a metronome, you're stepping up on a step, you step back down for, I don't know, it was 3 minutes or something like that, and you monitor your heart rate and RPE throughout. It measures aerobic fitness, but how valid is it for measuring the aerobic fitness of an athlete? I would say pretty much zero. Whereas I remember like one of the other members on our course said, oh, I'm definitely going to do that now with the team now this weekend to see what their aerobic fitness is like. And I was like, the time efficiency here is very poor. The applicability back to your sport is pretty low as well. Whereas doing something like a yo-yo test or a 1K test or a Bronco test it's far more valid to the sport you're looking at. And we look at these tests in a bit more detail. What I mean by reliability is if you do the same test a number of times with people at the exact same fitness level, will it still give the same result? So sometimes like tests can be wildly varying, particularly if you're doing like a 20-meter sprint and you do the first one in an indoor AstroTurf. With time, like if your timing gates, which you know are really accurate, and you do it on an indoor AstroTurf, and they do it 6 weeks later on a mucky pitch, it's just not reliable enough to each other, and that like the surface you're running on is so different and will slow players down so much, it's not giving you the same reading at all. Then finally, you have your practicality, just in terms of how realistic is it to do this and how practical is it to do this with a squad of 24, 30, 38 players, depending on what you're working with, to run them all off in a decent amount of time. Because you don't want to spend all day, like a full day of training, bringing in one player at a time for 15 minutes and then the next one, then the next one. It's things like, what can work in a squad? Do I bring him in groups of 8 to 12 players and can I manage that way? Do we have a few people with us to help with the testing? And if you're doing testing that might have like reasonably complicated scoring systems, sometimes it's not always okay to trust like the kit man or the football coach or whoever, because they might not really know what they're looking for. And then you're looking at it in like, oh, all these scores are completely irrelevant to me because we didn't record them properly. Or even like if it's a vertical jump, and I know my jump mat that I use, the height measure is on the right and there's another number, I'm still not certain what it is, on the left. And like sometimes you notice them and they're writing down the number on the left the whole time. Like all these results are completely irrelevant. They don't mean anything to us. So you have to be careful in terms of how practical or reliable it is when you're setting up your test that way as well. If you have any horror stories from doing any testing bits with teams that you're carrying out yourselves, not so much the 4-lap run.
None that I can think of off the top of my head. It's just like you said, I do apply the approach of what's tried and tested and what's being done at the top levels. Like there's no reason it can't be just transferred down. So like for me working rugby, the Bronco is the kind of the my go-to tell of how guys have improved. And yeah, it is for each individual, but it's for the coaches so they can kind of go, oh, are they getting fitter? Great. But I find it's even for myself, from my own playing perspective, knocking a few seconds off your time, whatever the test is, once you're repeating it it's a bit like hitting a PB in in the gym or something like that. There's a bit of pride kind of comes with it, even if you've only taken a little bit off. But yeah, like I largely just kind of stick to that kind of testing, or what I might do is to change it up depending on what kind of phase or period of the year we're training in. I might put in things like 150 shuttles or something like that, just to see what distance guys can cover and just see how they get on with that. But it's that they're kind of what I stick in between, just to from a testing perspective, and again that's rugby focused. So again, no horror stories, plenty of them from playing myself, but none from work experience now.
One horror story I have actually was I was measuring height with a team, and when I was building my stadiometer, I messed up the order of them, so they're all like, I don't know, 30 centimeters short than what they should be. And I never copped it till the end. I was like, why are they all so short? They look tall enough when I was there taking their height. So just look at a few specific examples of tests then, just generally, and we'll just focus on aerobic fitness first. The main one I use, mainly with GA teams, is either 1 kilometer run for time or 1.2 kilometer run for time. I don't really have a reason why I'd pick one over the other. Generally, I just go with 1 kilometer because it's just faster and quicker to do. That gives me a nice measure of aerobically where players are at. It's quite simple to set up, either an 100-meter shuttle up and down or a loop, depending on what I have access to. And just the key there is keep it consistent with that team for the season or a few seasons you're with them. It also gives me a good idea of their maximum aerobic speed or their average meters per second that they're covering, and I can base all the future runs I'm doing off that. It's handy for grouping the athletes together into like your fittest group, your medium group, and your lowest fitness group when you're prescribing specific distance runs and all like that. You can do similar based off a Bronco. I don't really use it with GA, but I know it is very popular in rugby circles. It will give you largely the same measure anyway. There just are those few more turns and stuff in it. A yo-yo, main reason I don't do it is because I don't have a speaker loud enough to play the beeps. It is a very useful test. It's just one that I don't use a whole pile. And then your 150s or something, like you said, Damien, there's something to throw in every now and again just to see. Like someone could be very good. Like if you do your 1K on a loop, it can be great to throw in the 150s just to see how efficient they are. Like, is it the same players the fastest in your 1K covering the most distance in your 150s, or is there a discrepancy there due to like how inefficient they are at turning or whatever it might be?
Yeah, explosive players tend to do very well in the 150s, I find, because their turn, they have that off the mark kind of explosion where some players, and I have seen this myself, that some athletes, sorry, I shouldn't say players, some athletes, I have found that when they're doing their 1K or 1200 meters, whichever one, because we've used both as well, that they will, that those leading out, that they can set a pace and stick to it quite well for a good bit of time. But if you have to ask them to kick up a gear, it can be a little bit of a challenge. So with the 150s, they kind of you get found out. So that's one of the reasons that I like to intersperse the two. So you can get two different readings as opposed to just having one kind of a fitness test there, would say a Bronco or a 1200 meter run or something, and then just going, yeah, we're getting fitter, but then not seeing like, is there any gap here? Is there, do you have those fluctuations between, distance covered in the 150s?
It can be interesting in the 150 as well. If someone covers a massive distance in their first shuttle, and by the sixth one they're covering like 2/3 that, like they're either really poor pacing themselves or aerobic fitness is lacking, hence why they're not recovering throughout those high intensity bursts.
Mm-hmm. It's actually another thing when you mentioned the yo-yos, the yo-yo test as well. When you mentioned, did we have any kind of horror stories? I remember a yo-yo test that was being put out over the speaker in a van, and nobody thought that the van should be left to run so that it would continue. And we were getting up towards I don't know, was it like level 13 or something like that? But the van shut off. Like, so the boys were they were hanging, like, they were pushing themselves. You couldn't repeat the test. The whole training was a waste of time because lads were they were already getting towards a point where they'd done too much, where you couldn't just give them a rest and start again. Like, to come back a week later and redo the test because the battery in the van just switched off. Like, if you had your radio on or something, it's gas.
I was doing the beep test in school one day. I was doing it off my phone and someone rang me. And I was like, there was only like 2 left and I was up around 11.2. Like, this was really good for like transition year girls. And then I had to stop. I was like, oh, sorry about that.
Best of luck getting them to redo that.
Yeah. Shane, any points tonight, those aerobic tests there? What do you generally favour with your teams?
Usually I stick with, I suppose it's rugby at the moment, so I stick with Bronco for the most part. And then since obviously lockdown was so... everything was so locked down, or was so hard during lockdown, I had, because obviously they were doing their own stuff, so I had 1K times and I had 5K times to program with as well. So this year's been a little bit different, but I find kind of similar to how Damien said, like, when you're doing the Broncos, it is more competitive, and it's competitive with themselves, which is even better to see. Like, there is a big push to beat that time, so I like to drop that in. That would be kind of my main go-to fitness at the moment. Fitness testing, sorry.
Yeah, a fellow I'd know fairly well, Michael Keogh, he's actually SNC with the Carlow Hurlers at the minute, but he always videos when he's doing the 1K. He does the 1K on a loop and always videos it and puts the video up at the end, particularly focused on the finish line, and has the time you cross the finish line flashes up on the screen. And he says, whatever the time is, I don't care. If there's 15 meters between you and the fella in front of you, he's videoing to see what kind of effort you put in those last 15 meters. See, am I going to try and beat this lad? Say we're both going here for position wing back, and like fitness is very important, wing back. And he just wants to see, okay, I'll record the time. The time is interesting, but the effort you put in those last 15 meters to try and catch that lad, that tells me a lot about who I want wing back in my team. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting point now. And he shows the videos, puts it up in the WhatsApp group or whatever they have afterwards as well, just to let everyone be some way accountable. Now, obviously, this is with adults. You wouldn't do that with younger players, I'd say.
If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. Teenagers. Yeah, no, that's very interesting.
That's really interesting.
It's bringing the subjective nature of, the testing into things, and yeah, it's very interesting. But yeah, no, they're the main. That's literally what I was going to say. The same point. They're the main ones that I would switch between and use at different points. I suppose the thing maybe to discuss next, and maybe around this, but when you should actually be looking to perform a fitness test is something that it's a challenge that I've come across. In that sometimes we could with certain head coaches or team managers, whatever it might be, that they kind of feel that, if we lose a game, we're not fit enough, and it might be a case of we'll throw in a fitness test there now or a fitness session, and you're like, even like, you know, you may not have lost the game because of fitness. You know, there's a whole host of reasons, but fitness tends to be something I see that gets focused on very, very quickly when a game is lost, or if you perceive to perform poorer than you should have. And I suppose knowing when to actually run fitness tests, and then like how long of a program you should kind of work off. Maybe we should chat about that for a little bit, or where do you think we should go?
Like your obvious time to do it is that first night back at training or whatever that way. And to an extent, I'd agree in that. I do want to see where players are at. Generally, before we do the first training back, I'm trying to give them a couple of runs to do in the weeks preceding that, just to have them ready for the first night back. The first night back, I'm basically just trying to get to know them, how they're moving, everything that way. And I'm probably not going to throw in a test the first night, but the second night, I probably will put in a 1K somewhere in or around the middle of that session. And to break, like using the 1K plan, I'll generally test that, group the players based on how to get on in that, test them 4 weeks later, and then follow a 6-week block, because you'll find some players respond really, really quickly to those first 4 weeks, and other players won't respond at all. So you just need to regroup athletes and recalculate the distances to run based on their fitness test score. Whereas after those first 4 weeks, they'll naturally kind of gravitate to where they need to be, and you're just kind of building everyone up gradually then after that. And I'll usually kind of time those 10 weeks for maybe a week before to finish, say a week before first round championship or the first big league game. So you have that week to kind of taper down into that first game. And after that, then it depends like on your kind of typical GA season, because the way it used to work was you went back in mid-January to be ready for club month in April. Kind of take May semi off, and then you might retest the 1K then again around mid-June. I'm using that more just to see who did nothing for the last while, to plan my runs for the next while, and to maybe give some lads a bit of a toe up to behind to say, like, listen, your fitness slacking off there a bit now, let's work on it again. While I do think it's important to see where fitness is, I think the planning and implementation of another fitness test, as you have so many other, and I would consider some of them more important variables as you're in peak championship season, I'm not entirely sure if it can always warrant including one again. That's not to say I wouldn't. If the manager asked me to, I definitely would, but it's not something I'd be pushing to include. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, I'd be similar in that my in season, and depending on like what kind of a break you have between games. So if there happens to be like a 3-week period comes up between, say, the end of a champ or the club month and a league game, or if you happen to have a few down weeks, then you might kind of go, Joe, I'd like to see where fitness levels are at, and maybe you're building up a bit of data there, a bit of information on guys, and kind of just you have something to kind of look back on then as the season progresses. But to work off whatever kind of plan you're putting forward. But I suppose where I see issues arising is that like you might have a game on a Saturday or Saturday or Sunday. You might have your next training session on a Tuesday. And it's like, oh, I want to see what, manager comes in and go, I want to test their fitness. And you're like, well, if you have a game, I've often seen it with a game coming up the next week. And to me, that's completely, I suppose, it's kind of pointless, because you're trying to improve from the last day and to get ready for a game again at the end of the next week. That it's not really the best use of time, I don't feel. And it's, what are you going to use those fitness results for? Like in the lead up to a game, it's
because if they're down, it could be a massive impact on self-confidence of the players. That like, oh geez, all our fitness tests are down. How are we going to cope in this game at all? Like you'd wonder why are they dropping anyway if you've reasonably well planned out your season, but it can have quite a negative impact. Plus, there could be the residual effects of fatigue from the previous game that like stops them doing as well in the fitness test.
Yeah, so that's my only thing. Like I'd be very much along the lines of if it's very clear that there's going to be a break in the season. I suppose with the GA, things are very rarely very clear. But, so it's hard. It can be hard to plan your whole season, from the get-go. But if it starts to become apparent that there's going to be a break, then if there's a clear break, then it's like, okay, well, like we've did our fitness test here, we've trained all along, we've played all these games. Let's just see in a comparison to where we're at, and just, it might pop in once in the year, maybe twice in a season. Now, in a 12-month GA season, which I'm privy to the odd time. You could end up with your pre-season fitness test, and then you could have 2 in-season fitness tests sporadically throughout the year. But planning them in is almost like something that you're like, okay, well look, we're finished this section of the competition, or we've a break in the competition. Let's just see where we're at. Are we improving? Are we staying where we are? Have we regressed in some way? And that I find that planning them in advance is something I kind of put a pin in a little, and I keep them for when the opportunity arises to input a fitness test.
It's just one tiny thing to note on that is if you are ever looking up norms on teams, if you're looking at professional soccer, professional rugby teams, they have the exact same concerns, and that's very, very difficult to implement these tests in season. So generally when you find norms, they're done pre-season when they're either fatigued after a block of pre-season, or they're just haven't done very little training. So just keep that in mind, that has influenced the norms you are seeing of players that may be published in research.
Yeah. How about you, Shane, with rugby? What do you look for?
I'd be kind of exactly the same as you guys. I don't like to plan it too far ahead, because especially like Damo, you'll know in rugby, if there is a huge block available, it's usually for rescheduled games. So it's usually some games that haven't gone right, they're leaving that leeway so we can fill it with another game that's meant to come through. More likely than not, there's going to be a game to go in there, or like some sort of Mickey Mouse Cup game will come up somehow. There'll be a game thrown in rather than giving you the time for fitness. So there's no point in planning it. It's just if it does happen to come up, well, like say for example, if a game was called off the week before a bye week, so you knew, okay, well they have 2 weeks now, I'll take them this Saturday and do their fitness testing because they don't have a game or something. If that pops up, it's there as an option that we can discuss with the manager. So it's always on the back burner, kind of always there if it needs to be used, but just always thinking of the ramifications it'll have and just making sure that the management team know that it's not just like, oh, last minute, right, sure, we'll do this, and it'll tire them out. Because I'm sure you've all probably had the example, a lot of older style managers now would still have the opinion that, right, they lost at the weekend, they were crap, do a Bronco with them, or go send them for laps, or go make them run, knowing full well they have a game on Saturday, but want to punish them almost in some way. So it's trying to avoid that at all costs, really.
Yeah, which isn't easy.
No, not at all.
No, so that's kind of looked at the various types of aerobic testing which will fit in season. When it comes to power, speed, or strength, then how do we start looking at that? Just in terms of power myself, I will generally try and do a vertical jump at least once a week. Like start a training, come in. If you're in runners, just jump straight away. Before ever you do a warm up or anything like that, just it gives me decent bit of information on like how ready they are, how fatigued they are from the previous game or the previous training. Even just looking at them jump, you can tell what kind of humour they're in. Are they looking a bit lethargic or sluggish? Are they looking up first? Check the numbers. I'll generally kind of go, without getting too statsy based, I'll generally look at a standard deviation above or below their average. If they're gone one standard deviation below that particular person, I'm like, what's up? Okay, why is this down a good bit? And it opens up your conversation. Or like, I did a sprint session myself last night. I was like, oh, great idea. Or got a dead leg actually a week ago. I'm not fully recovered from it. Like, oh, we will see that go up over time. So as well as telling you players' readiness to train, you would also hopefully see a trend in their vertical jump. If not staying the same, possibly then going up across the season as well. And that's something players actually quite like to see, because when they realise the relevance of how vertical jump impacts their speed and power, and they see it going up, like, oh, this is very good. It's also important if players are trying to lose or gain weight, that if they're trying to gain weight and vertical jump stays the same, they are getting more powerful because they're lifting more weight the same height. Or if they're trying to lose weight, you'd often be concerned that because low energy, they're losing strength, that vertical jump can go down if they're losing too fast. So that informs you a good bit there as well. But I just find it a great way, along with trying to get their weight as well, before at least one training session a week, but preferably before all of them, and never before a game, because I don't want that affecting their confidence going into it.
So do you have them just come straight in to the mat, do their jump, and then carry on whatever training session it is?
Yeah, like I bring the mat into the changing room. So and I just leave, like the first couple of times you need to show them it, but after a while they know everything, and I just leave a sheet with all their names and their average, their maximum, their minimum, and a standard deviation written on the sheet, and I leave the pen there, and they jump and they write it down.
Nobody's taking your mat now?
No one is taking the mat, no.
It's your mind
big,
like,
it's big. You
doesn't
see it going.
Just Murph, if you could just send me on where and when you're training there, I just might drop down there. Because I had a mat a few years ago, and I don't anymore. So what I do, and like it can be a bit tougher now with rugby to get with the rugby club I'm in currently, I should say, because previously everyone had to come through the gym or into the dressing rooms, whatever. Now, I suppose, especially this year, lads are just showing up, they're ready to go. But last year, guys would still turn up to training in their car, in their gear, and they mightn't get into the dressing room until afterwards to go for a shower when they're covered in muck or whatever. So trying to get guys to pull in first, I found that there was certain things in the culture of the club I was in that I was able to work on and improve, and then there were other things that were just out of my I suppose out of my reach. Well, what I did was I put a 2 meter or 3 meter tape down on the ground, just 3 meter marked tape at centimeters the whole way along, and guys just come in for themselves. If they happen to go into the gym first, they'll just do a broad jump, and just kind of if they notice that they're down, or if I notice, I wouldn't have all their numbers off the top of my head, because again, trying to get lads to track it or to even fill out things can be a bit of troublesome at times. But what I'll like, if they happen to notice that they're down a bit, if they're going to do the jump, they'll notice whether they're up or down or in or on the same anyway. And then it's just largely conversation based after that. So that I suppose subjective analysis I found to be really beneficial at times, where like just chatting to guys in general doesn't seem like a very focused conversation about training or anything like that. Just chatting to people about how they feel. How's your day? How's your work day? How are you? How are you feeling after the training the last day? And people will get chatty with you, and it's very quick to pick up who's feeling a little bit tired, and if that happens to be something that's across the board, then it could lead to the maybe changing of or altering or reducing of a training session there and then. But it's ideally you'd have a measure like that, and it's something I'd rather have, and mix that in with the subjective measuring. But again, that's just down to costs really at the moment and where I'm putting my money. But yeah, I do feel that sometimes people will overlook and I know we've talked about this before in the past, the subjective analysis, that those conversations and the relationship that you build up with players, with athletes, and having a mutual understanding of each other. I think that's massive.
It's where the RPE comes in so handy. Because say, for example, if someone does your broad jump test and they're 10 meters down, if you talk to them and then they're like, oh, I'm actually feeling horrible, I was up all night sick, not great, you're like, okay, cool, I can pretty much write that off because they're not feeling great, it's of no use to me. Whereas if they do the same, they come in, they're like, no, feel great, never felt better, you're like, okay, now we have something that we have to address here. So that simple, like they could be, if you look at it on paper, it's the exact same test, exact same kind of result, exact same scoring criteria. It's just how that player feels or what that player went through the night before can be so important. And if you don't have those conversations or have that score, you just don't know.
In terms of still kind of your main power stuff, in terms of strength tests, then what kind of stuff would you look at, or how often would you bring that into your gym sessions or that?
I suppose I only use a strength test to, I suppose, in part of pre-season to see where people are at, just to work out, so people know what they're to be working off, if we're working off percentages or anything like that. So that's the first and foremost. And then now and then, I suppose it depends on how the season is going, what way games line up, say in the lead into Christmas. I try to get another strength test in just before Christmas as well. Now that depends on the sport. So if you're doing Gaelic, if you're working in Gaelic sports, you're not going to be getting that period. But basically, at some point in the mid-season, I try to get a second strength test in during a period of where things are going to be down, just so we can see where strength is at, and where has it improved across the season, has it stagnated, has it stayed as it was coming in, or has it reduced across the season. And then so that I say, if I look at rugby, for example, now, and I know this season is wallop, but it would be the same last season, where I had my pre-season, strength testing, and then I bring in strength testing. I'm doing it in a week and a half, and I did the same thing last year. And it was just a nice little measure there of where the blocks of training we'd gone through had led the players to. But it wouldn't be something I would use often, is kind of what I'm trying to get to. It might there might be one at the end of the season, if you can pull everyone together. If there's a win at the end of the season, it might be very hard to get people to come back for a strength test. If there's a big loss, it can be even harder again to bring people back for an end of season strength test. So it's largely just that pre-season strength test when you're coming on board first, before then you work through your blocks, and then mid-season at some point, whenever the opportunity arises, just to see how things are going.
I'll do similar future pre-season, but it's mainly just to work out percentages and where lads are at and kind of see have they been putting into work. And even then, I'm probably only really doing 1RM trap bar deadlift and chin-ups or pull-ups to failure. I generally don't try and do a squat 1RM because I don't always trust the technique of some of the players I'm working with. And just in general as well, I don't tend to get GA players to barbell bench press. I'm just a bit too worried about shoulder concerns. And I'm definitely not going to 1RM a dumbbell bench or something like that. So the trap bar deadlift is my main lower body one, and then the chin-ups to failure is my muscular endurance one for upper body or relative strength. It's pretty much all I'll do there, because I'm kind of using the vertical jump as my main monitoring tool over time then as well. How about you, Shane?
Yeah, I'd be the same. I actually would do barbell bench press, but I usually, at the moment, I'm working mostly in 3RM percentages, just because, again, I'm not sure how much I trust the form technique, and usually you'll see people will sacrifice form much more for a 1RM than they will for a 3, in my experience, because if they're 1RM, they know, right, this is all out for 1. I just want to get this weight up off the ground. I don't really care about my back, my spine, my future, my health. Just get this off the ground. Where at least if it's 3RM, they know there's more to come, so they will try and keep safety and form will be in the back of their mind. So I find that a lot easier, just from a safety and health point of view. I think that works best for me.
Yeah, that's what I was always interested in. Like when you go 3RM, 1RM, 3RM, or 5RM, I see people doing them all. Like I always go 1RM. I never consider anything else. I'm just like, that's interesting. You do it based on the technique is less likely to break down on a 3RM. What about you there, Damien?
I stick to 1RMs as well, but it's partially built off, that's what people seem to be used to as much as well, and they want to know what their 1 rep max actually is, because it's just a talking point, or it's a very easy focus point. So yeah, I kind of stick to that. Now I do keep barbell bench and squat in there, but I monitor the squat, and I suppose when I go in first to a team, I'll kind of see what they're doing and talk to athletes. But then as you train them, as you coach them over months, then when we get around to doing a strength test again, they know very clearly what the parameters of the movement are, what's being looked for, and say the same thing for squat, that I want them going to a certain a certain depth. For bench, their ass is staying on the bench. If their ass lifts, we're not taking that. It's there's certain things that I will look for from them, that, and this is the other thing, is that I'm there when they're doing the strength testing. I'm there when they're doing it. So even if there's little groups, little pods, it's very easy to step back. You can kind of have an eye on each one of the pods as they're going, or I might bring in, say, somebody who's doing S&C with another team to watch on, and to just make sure we're both on the same page of what I'm looking for, so they can kind of see, well, here you're not, that you may have moved the weight up, but you didn't squat anywhere near, say, 90 degrees, or your ass was completely off the bench there for those two exercises. So it's just, there is a bit of coaching there, and it's not. So I'm very careful to not say program for strength testing for 1 rep max, and then leave lads off to do it, on a session by themselves. I'm very kind of focused on that.
Yeah, the team I'm working with at the moment, we also have a lot of younger lads. So a lot of lads would have come off the 18s. So I'd like to get them proficient first. Plus, you'd know yourselves with young lads, if strength testing is 1RM, regardless of what I say, they're probably going to do it on their own as well. So at least if it's 3RM and they do it on their own, they're less likely to hurt themselves.
That's a good point, and brings us on to kind of age appropriateness of what you're doing, both in terms of training age and just the age of the athlete themselves. I just know from being involved with development squads and that over the few years, and what the lads who look after the athletic development side of things, they'll be looking. Like, the main things to look at there is height and weight, just to see how much are they growing or not growing. They will touch on vertical jump. Recently, they've started including an isometric mid-thigh pull, which is something, if I had access to, I definitely would include. That's something they're tracking over time now as well. Then they'll also look at inverted rows and push-ups to failure. But to control for that can be difficult, as same as you said there, Damien. What exactly a 1RM squat looks like can be very different based on the two coaches. Like, again, I don't mean to diss high school, college athletes or in America and that, but sometimes the squats don't move very far and some of them go all the way down. So having that level of consistency there, and the lads who majority, it's usually interns from Carlow IT that run the testing. So they leave a cone on the ground and place a tennis ball on that, and your chest has to touch that cone just to ensure consistency across the board for the push-ups. And they made up inverted aluminium U's or ends, I suppose, to be turned around, and your chest has to touch the bar for an inverted row to count, and your arms have to be locked out straight at the bottom. So that's just to keep a consistency there with across players, but also for the same player over the course of his under 14, 15 and 16, to lots of testing with the academy over time. Realistically, your 1RM strength testing, you're probably not going to do much that with that age group, just because they're growing so much that like they don't have enough control themselves at all the exercises. Plus, there is a learning ability in the likes of a squat, or a bench press, a deadlift.
They're skill.
They are a skill, and if you don't have the skill properly, it's not an accurate measure, but it's also just not safe for anyone if you're doing it incorrectly. So that's why
There's also a huge gap in weightlifting experience around that age. Like, there could be some lads who have started early and are way ahead of the curve, and then there's lads who this is their first weight session when they come to you.
I actually find that to be quite an issue with, especially in rugby, underage rugby. I've noticed, I've done a little bit of work with clubs of minute where you'll have somebody who's been coached or has someone in their life that has coached them, and they'll kind of walk in and go, oh, like, you know, almost dismiss you as a coach, even like, you know, that teenage arrogance, you know, and their friends will look at what they're doing, but not actually kind of realize that they're not in a position to be able to do that. And, you know, they'll see their buddy putting all these weights on the bar and they'll try to do the same, and it just becomes a contortion, like in their movement. It's a real danger. So that's, I see that more with teenagers than I do with adults, but it's definitely something to be very careful of, I think, and it probably a good reason as well for, like, down those lines with your adolescents or your younger athletes. Like, I don't see why they'd ever have to do a 1RM or anything like that. It's
as they get into under 18, like up to that under 18, you can start implementing it if you're confident of their technique being solid enough to go through it. I know something they really push with the Carlow Miners is they do try and test every 6 weeks throughout the season, and it's just to monitor, are these programs working? Is this giving us benefit in terms of their quality of movement and the overall product of how heavy they can lift? And it's just good for tracking them, the same player, you know, because there's ways Leinster Council kind of want it anyway, but across minor squads in Leinster. But it's also good to see a player who spends 2 years minor and then 2 years under 20. Is he making more or less the same improvements throughout? Do they taper off? Is there a reason why? It just gives you a bit more idea around why various things are happening based on strength, height, weight, everything changing around that way. Also, I think at that age, it's particularly in the 15, 16 age group, it's worth promoting a focus on the process over the outcome. That it is really important to squat well, to press well, to deadlift well, as opposed to how heavy. And because it is essentially development, it's not what the overall product is, how good you are, it's how well you do stuff, because ultimately it's to make you a better adult player as opposed to a good player in the here and now. Lastly, just touching on speed, because now ideally, you'd have access to timing gates. You'd have a few of them. And like, if you've access to timing gates, I would prioritize going 5, 10 and 20 meters. If I only had the 2 gates, I would go 5 and 20 because that's where the most norms for GA are available. I know some other sports will look a lot longer. NFL looks at the 40-yard dash, but even they break that down into segments based on the player. Like your or the linebackers. I don't really care how long it takes them to do 40 yards, but those first 5 or those first 10, that's really important. And vice versa, whereas your wide receivers, you want to see their 40, see what their top speed is like. It's similar then in GA, and you look at how like some players will be really good at the first 5, but not that quick over 20, and vice versa. And you'll see similar in rugby. But that's if you have the timing gates. I know when I've been working with a couple of car teams, we have access to that from the IT, but myself, I don't have those. It's a long-term investment plan.
Yeah, it can be very hard to measure. I have speed gates. They haven't worked in about 2 years because a battery. A battery exploded inside one of them, so I have to get it soldered. But yeah, like they're very handy. But testing speed without them, obviously, if you look, you can obviously just get out your old measure and just get your stopwatch and go. You're obviously you're not going to be as accurate as you'd like to be, but you're right. Like you're 20 meters there, especially for your Gaelic sports. Like how fast can you cover that distance? Like how much speed can you actually generate there in those short ranges? Because how often you do it, but how often do you find an athlete in say GA sports or GA or soccer or something like that where they'll hit top speed for quite a distance? You don't really get it. You might get Jack McCaffrey, when he was playing, or someone like that who just bullets, just makes that line and goes.
In the way.
Yeah, exactly. But for a lot of others, they're testing that longer speed doesn't have any relevance, cause, or you can't really use it that well. Whereas the first 10 meters, 20 meters. Say if I'm looking at rugby, I'm very interested in what they can do over 5 to 10 meters. That's very important to me. Whereas their 40 or 50 meter sprint, like it's nice to know it. It's nice to see where lads are at. But that 5, 10 and 20 are big.
Just a bit to tie in with last week, though, that overall top speed is an excellent stimulus for the body. And I have seen times coaches will use, and something I would like to do myself if I get them, is using the timing gates for your flying 20s, even just as an incentive to make sure athletes are putting in the maximum amount of effort. And they, it's still good to see improvements over time in your speed, regardless of what distance it's over, because a faster player is most likely an improved athlete.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to hammer home that like that 40-yard dash number, like the combine is an incredible measure of athletic performance, but it is also, there's a Hollywood aspect to it as well. Like, so it's the NFL flagship, let's bring together all these insane athletes. So the 40-yard dash is somewhat more Hollywood than it's relevant, if that makes sense. Like even a receiver, they're never going to get 40 yards clear unless you're like insanely away from someone, or you can chase back someone who's slow and you just have a deadline to them who's open, but you're rarely going to have 40 yards open space where you can just, and even if you have 40 yards open space, you're probably not going to need to be top speed going through if there's no one within 40 yards of you. So it's to be taken with a pinch of salt. Obviously it's handy if you have one of the top performance centers in the world and the time and the media attention to get 40-yard dashes for anyone who comes your way. Obviously it's great, but it's definitely not as helpful as your 5 and your 20-yard numbers.
Just then a couple of other tests that might be worth looking at in terms of like you monitoring yourself as an athlete or for your own general health. That like when we touched on the CrossFit stuff with Pádraig a few weeks ago, that like he mentioned some of the big workouts like Fran, Murph, Grace, stuff like that. It's worth including something like that every 6, 8, 12 weeks just to see where you as an athlete currently are. Whether it be like you're focusing on strength for a block of time and you do your aerobic test and you realize, I actually went down an awful lot. I thought I'd be able to maintain my aerobic fitness over this time. That could be something you include, like just a 12-minute run, a 6-minute run, a 1K, a 5K. If it's on a bike, just do 5 minutes, see what your average watts are on the bike, little things like that. Also some general strength ones that are worth looking at, like plank for time, push-ups, dips, chin-ups, just to see where your strength is at. If you're going through a period of you're trying to lose weight and you notice that like your dips, your push-ups, stuff like that should be going up if you're losing weight, and if they're going down, you're probably losing weight a bit too quickly and losing strength along with it. Same as if you're trying to put on weight and bulk up a bit, that if your chin-ups, your push-ups, stuff like that go down, there's a good chance you're putting on weight too quickly. You're probably just putting on more fat than useful muscle or relevant muscle and stuff like that. I think some norms for health around, realistically, you should be able to hold a good plank for well over a minute and up towards 2, and a side plank for over a minute and near 90 seconds as well. That's also a nice one to just compare right to left to see if any particular imbalances there. They're just some I'd work with sometimes with people in general to see how healthy they are.
Yeah, they'd make up most of the programs, or they'd be, especially the planks, the longer planks would be a big part of a lot of the programming I would do.
Yeah, that pretty much wraps up our chat then on fitness testing. The main things to talk about is, first of all, is make sure you have tests that are relevant to who you're working with, whether it be the sport, the athlete, their goals that they're aiming for, that you're testing to get useful information, not just for the sake of it. I think it's worthwhile implementing tests that give you information that you can go and use, like percentages of 1RM for lifts or mass for runs that you're going doing. And then if you have a number of tests that are very widely used in your sport, then use them and use the norms to compare to, but don't use them as your sole aim. And they'd be the main things we'd say. Anything else on that?
No, that's it. Don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to.
Yeah, just kind of as you said, just make sure that it is sport specific. Don't just do, I don't know, because the coach you had in the past in a sport that you're not coaching in now did it, or that's the one you know best. Make sure it is sport specific, or it is the norm for your sport.
And also try not to get too sport specific. Don't overcomplicate it with like trying to do a 1K run with like someone tackling you in the middle of it and stuff like that. Just
down and up every 10 meters.
Yeah, that's good. We purposely left out talk about body composition today because we want to dedicate a full episode to that and just talk about for both health and performance. And we also hope to have a guest on next week. If anything in particular you'd like us to cover, please just give any of us a shout, and see you or hear you in the next episode.